In this video, we'll be learning about strategies to achieve hemocompatibility, which simply means compatibility with blood. The learning objectives of this video are to understand the mechanisms by which blood-contacting medical devices can fail, which include thrombosis, complement activation, and hemolysis, and to understand strategies that can be used to achieve hemocompatibility. These include chelation, heparinization, surface modification, and endothelialization. In previous videos, we've talked about hemostatic mechanisms for stopping bleeding. Now, as we shift our focus to hemocompatibility, we're going to talk about the mechanisms by which medical devices that contact blood can fail. So these include things like the tubing in hemodialysis machines that's used, or other extracorporeal devices that have blood flowing through them, like a heart-lung machine. This could also be vascular grafts, such as are shown here, or heart valves, which are shown down here. So all these devices can fail due to localized blood clotting, so it's blood clotting on the surface of the material, or due to systemic effects. So these could be the results of device-mediated coagulation, specifically thrombus embolization. So that's when a piece of blood clot breaks off and then travels to an organ kind of downstream from the device. Also, of course, hemostasis is critical in this process, so we have to consider the role of platelets in the coagulation cascade and the role of the endothelium, which is why we talked about the first two before. So when we learned about hemostatic mechanisms that exist to stop bleeding, we previously talked about platelets and the formation of the platelet plug that stops bleeding, and the coagulation cascade that reinforces that plug through the formation of a fibrin mesh. So this is a big picture overview of the coagulation cascade, and we learned about the extrinsic pathway, which that's very important. When we have damage to the tissue vessel, there's the tissue factor that mediates activation of the coagulation cascade via this pathway. And then the intrinsic pathway, which is driven by adsorption of one of those factors to a negatively charged surface. Both of them converge on the common pathway down here. And then the key player in that, or one of the key players in that common pathway, is thrombin. So thrombin, well, you have the activation of factor 10, and then you get the activation of thrombin, which then cleaves fibrinogen to fibrin, and then that forms the fibrin mesh that reinforces the clot. So our question as we move forward is, how can we prevent coagulation and engineer hemocompatible materials? Well, first, let's take a more detailed look at the coagulation cascade. If you look at all the steps that are involved here, you see a lot of cofactors in addition to the factors that are involved in each step. And a very common one is calcium. So you see it plays a role in the conversion of factor 9 to factor 9A. It's also this cofactor in the conversion of factor 10 to factor 10A, and that's all in the intrinsic pathway. In the extrinsic pathway, it plays a role, again, in the conversion of factor 10 to factor 10A. It also plays a role in the conversion of prothrombin to thrombin by factor 10A. So calcium is a very critical cofactor in coagulation, which leads us to our first method, which is going to be prevention of coagulation with chelating agents. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to show you a brief YouTube video that's about 2 minutes long. This video is actually, he's talking about processing blood collected from chickens that you can use in a garden, he talks about. But the method of preventing coagulation is very pertinent. So I'm just going to let him talk for almost the full 2 minutes, and then we'll come back to it.
Okay. This morning we processed 24 chickens, and as we often do, we used sodium citrate available at cooking suppliers. This is something that chefs typically use. Its common name is sour salt, And a lot of chefs use it to, you know, to make cream sauces, not clump, to make macaroni and cheese nice and creamy. Medical labs also use it to keep blood from clotting. So a couple of years ago I thought, why don't we use it when we process chickens and catch the blood? So we have buckets under our killing cones that we catch the blood in, and if we want the blood to be completely liquid, no clots at all, so that we can use it in a spray in the garden, as a foliar spray or whatever, we'll put about a tablespoon of sodium citrate into a bucket with some water. And then when you do that, the blood that you collect comes out like this. Completely liquid, no clots. If you don't use the sodium citrate, the blood that you collect comes out looking like this, like jello or liver. You can dehydrate this or use it, but it would be hard to use this in a spray or use it directly in your garden because it's too clumpy without drying it and turning it into a blood meal, for instance. See, it's like pieces of liver. It's just clots, basically. So there you go. Sodium citrate, something you might want to try using next time you process chicken.
Okay, so I don't know about the gardening applications, but I do like that video because I think it's a very potent demonstration of how effective chelation can be for preventing coagulation. So, well, what do we mean by chelation and what is a chelator? Well, a chelator or a chelating agent is any substance whose molecules can form several bonds to a single metal ion. So in his video, he used citrate or sodium citrate, so that's just a sodium salt of citrate, which is what's shown down here, is generally viewed as a safe and effective way to prevent coagulation. So as he said in the video, it's commonly used in medical labs to prevent coagulation. Now, how does this work? So this is showing right here. I'll circle the citrate molecule. And you'll see that it has 3 carboxylate anions. So that's 3 COO minus groups. So those are able to form bonds, so electrostatic interactions with calcium cations, and so they pull them out of solution or they chelate them. So this is a very effective way of pulling that calcium out so that it can't participate in those reactions of the coagulation cascade. And this is frequently used in dialysis and in other extracorporeal devices that have blood circulating through them to prevent coagulation. So in dialysis, you have blood that is flowing through some tubing, and then here this is your membrane. So it's a semi-permeable membrane that is used to remove toxins that have built up in the blood, so they're able to pass through the pores, and then the blood cells stay inside the tubing. Here I've got more of a cross-section of what the tubing looks like. So here, this is a picture of your filter on the left. On the right is the cross-section. So you see in this cross-section, so there's all these tubes that are semi-permeable. So that's your semi-permeable membrane. Your blood flows in the top and then flows through each of these tubes within this filter cartridge, and then comes out on the other side, goes through the blood outlet. There's also in the space around these tubes that the blood's flowing through, you have some solution. So that's your dialyzing solution. So an inlet and an outlet to remove those toxins. But as blood is flowing through here, if you get anything that absorbs onto the surface, then that can trigger coagulation, and that could plug up the filter tubes and keep it from working properly. You also have, of course, the risk of thromboembolization. So to prevent that, there's injection of this anticoagulant in the process. So this is showing a patient, you have the blood being removed for cleaning, and the first step is the anticoagulation, usually with citrate. So that citrate chelates the calcium, then the blood can flow through your cartridge in the dialysis machine, shown up at the top, without risk of coagulation, and then it will go back into the patient. Now, before it goes back in, they have to add back a lot of calcium so that the blood can clot properly once it's back in the patient's body. But that's not shown on here. So that's chelation. That's one strategy. Another strategy, which we've already learned about, is heparinization. So we previously talked about heparin modification to improve biocompatibility when we learned about biological surface modifications. And our example was this Gore pro-patent vascular graft, which has been modified with this Carmeta bioactive surface technology. And we didn't talk a whole lot about what this is other than to say that it's heparin functionalization. But actually what they do is they take, first, they modify the surface of the vascular graft, which is polytetrafluoroethylene based. And they do this with a layer-by-layer assembly process, like in the homework problem from homework 2. So they're building up a polymer multi-layer via the layer-by-layer process, and then the final layer has amine groups on it, and then they use those amine groups to conjugate to the end of the heparin molecules. So they have this fancy endpoint modification strategy where they're using actually aldehyde groups on the end of the heparin to form bonds with those amine groups on the surface. So it's a shift-based reaction. But once this graft is in place, this graft will be used for femoral distal bypass, where you're going around a blockage in the femoral artery, as shown in the figures. And last time we also went over some of this data where you can see it's not as good as a saphenous vein, but it's better than a non-modified graft. So our heparinization improves blood compatibility or hemocompatibility. So why does this work? What exactly is heparin doing? Well, heparin itself, it's a highly negatively charged polysaccharide that possesses inherent anticoagulant properties. So it's actually secreted by cells in the body, specifically cells known as basophils. Heparin functions as an anticoagulant by binding antithrombin 3, or AT3, to form a complex. So when heparin is conjugated with AT3, it actually increases AT3's effectiveness at inhibiting thrombin. So antithrombin inhibits thrombin. And so the AT3 forms a tight complex with thrombin and thus prevents exposure of thrombin's catalytic site. So it's keeping the thrombin from acting in the cleavage of fibrinogen and in those other reactions. So it also inhibits other steps in the coagulation cascade. So at a very key level here, we're inhibiting the conversion of fibrinogen to fibrin, so you're not going to get that fibrin polymerization to form the fibrin clot. So shown here, we're taking this out of the equation. So there's no thrombin, you don't get any fibrin. You also don't get the factor 13A that will stabilize fibrin clots. So that's why heparinization is effective. Another strategy that we can consider is endothelialization. And this is because, well, the endothelium of blood vessels is naturally hemocompatible. If it weren't, we'd have some serious problems. So this is showing a cross-section of a vessel. And then you see here, these are the endothelial cells that we're concerned about here. So those are the cells that line the inside of your vessels. So The endothelium, it's a heterogeneous surface, but the endothelial cells are the key player here. And in its native state, so this is not after an injury, of course, because that will activate coagulation. In its native state, it has many anticoagulant properties. So there actually is some heparin on the surface. There is also thrombomodulin, which, as its name implies, modulates thrombosis or the coagulation cascade. Endothelial cells also secrete soluble mediators that inhibit platelets and promote thrombolysis. So this plasmin here, that's an enzyme that cleaves fibrin. As we've learned about already, of course, the endothelium can be stimulated to promote coagulation upon an injury, but I won't go over that here since we already covered that in the previous video. So if we consider that the endothelium is naturally hemocompatible, a good strategy would be to just promote endothelialization of a blood contacting device. But that's not always practical, and it's not trivial to do. Besides coagulation, we also have other concerns for blood contacting devices. One is hemolysis, which is essentially just the breaking open of erythrocytes or red blood cells to release hemoglobin, and this can occur either due to direct contact with a material or a device surface, so that can be material-induced hemolysis, but it can also occur due to exposure to leachables coming out of a device. In addition to hemolysis, we of course have to worry about complement activation, which can occur due to protein adsorption to our surface, specifically C3b. So these are other things that we have to test for. When we learned about in the innate immune system, we talked about complement, but just as a refresher, the complement system consists of a lot of plasma proteins that participate in this cascade of reactions to eliminate foreign invaders. And what we're concerned with here is this alternative pathway, which is initiated by this C3b adsorption to the surface. So that can happen on the surface of a material, and then that will kick off the complement cascade. And then that was illustrated here. So we have C3b adsorption here, and then we'll proceed through the complement pathway. And then that's very problematic because it triggers a lot of inflammation, and then it also culminates in the formation of the membrane attack complex. So those are all of our concerns and some strategies. So now let's just summarize. If we want to circumvent hemostatic mechanisms and achieve hemocompatibility, we can promote endothelialization of our biomaterial surface. And this can be done by making our material bioactive. And we want to encourage the recruitment and the migration of endothelial cells so we can get migration from the surrounding blood vessels. This could occur, for example, in a vascular graft that might be pertinent or in a stent. But this is not always practical or trivial to do. If you're going to try to promote endothelialization, you would have to do pretty extensive characterization to make sure you have a functional endothelium. So you'd want to look at the phenotype of the cells, look at their gene expression by something like RT-PCR, look at protein expression, for example, by ELISA and Western blotting, to make sure that the endothelial cells are behaving like a healthy endothelium and not like an injured one. You would also probably want to do immunohistochemistry to look at structurally what the cells look like and look at the junctions they form with the surrounding endothelial cells, because that's a very important part of having a healthy endothelium as well, because they have to have some barrier function. The other strategy that we have is we can prevent protein adsorption, because of course if we have no protein on the surface, then we're not going to have any platelet attachment and activation, so that'll improve hemocompatibility. We can also circumvent complement activation this way. The problem there is that it's difficult to completely prevent protein adsorption. So realistically, it might be better to just try to promote selective protein adsorption. So for example, if we had a surface that exhibits very high affinity for albumin, which is abundant in blood, and then that albumin adsorbs to the surface and then blocks it so that no other proteins adsorb, then that might be an effective way to prevent platelet attachment and thrombosis and complement activation. The last strategy is to modify our surface with heparin. So this would be a biological surface modification, which we learned about before. So that concludes this video. In the next video, we'll be talking about methods to test for hemocompatibility.